Hello everyone, if you're new to my channel, consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do that. Thanks. By the way, I also have another Naruto and Luffy fanfiction channel. If you are interested, link is in the description. The Devil Wears White. The ASL trio have been kidnapped, taken to a place that people only see in their nightmares. Children are tested on and lives are thrown away carelessly. How will they escape? If they do, who can they trust? And what's with these strange new powers? Now this is the season 1 of this fanfiction. It will have a season 2 where the same Luffy starts his adventure as from East Blue like in canon, but stronger and experienced. I don't own anything, adios.
The next day began much better than the previous. Although Luffy still had a nightmare, it was only once, when they were already waking up anyways. Now that they were fully rested, they all felt much better than before, the edge they had been on yesterday gone as if it hadn't happened. The three laid in bed, waking up still, all of them staring at the ceiling with barely open eyes. "S breakfast done yet?" Ace asked in a mumble. Sabou listened for a second before nodding. "Thatch just finished. If we go now we'll get there before everyone starts crowding in," Sabou said, already dragging himself up into a sitting position. Ace groaned but also sat up, already missing the feeling of the comfy mattress and warm blankets. Luffy sat up as well, doing so silently, and stood up, stretching his arms over his head just a bit further than a normal human would be able to. The fact that the boy hadn't used his devil fruit powers once in front of the pirates was something that continued to amaze Ace and Sabou, having expected him to use them without thinking, but that wasn't the case. Sabou was reminded of the fact that Luffy had also managed to fool everyone into thinking he was a mute because they told him not to talk to anyone, and suddenly he wasn't as surprised. Not using his powers though seemed to be putting a strain on the youngest, because whenever they were alone Luffy would stretch his arms or legs, using his fruit in the process, making the brothers think that maybe he was more bothered about it than they thought. The three walked to the galley, ignoring any looks they got from curious pirates. After they had heard Haruto's name yesterday they had shut themselves in their room, not even coming out for meals. Luckily Sabou noticed that Thatch had been kind enough to leave a platter outside their door for them at lunch and then for dinner as well. The brothers had definitely not been expecting it, thinking the pirates wouldn't want to waste food on them if they weren't in the galley to eat it, so when the chef did it they felt a bit better, even if their day had been horrible until then. Sabou was going to make sure to thank the chef when he could, grateful that he had fed them. The brothers knew they were going to be staying with the pirates for a while now. They knew that they should at least become friendly with them, but there was that piece of them, warning them that the second they started getting closer, they would be betrayed. Of course, no matter how close they got to anyone, they weren't going to tell them anything about their powers, because that would just be opening the door for betrayal. The brothers could try and be distant forever, but how long would it be until the pirates got fed up with them and turned? That wasn't something the three wanted to risk, so if they could avoid it, they would. "Hey, you three made it." As they entered the galley Thatch was the first to notice, smiling brightly as he set a plate on the table, probably food for himself. Sabou smiled at the man, nodding as he and his brothers went to the table and sat down. "We did," Sabou said as Thatch ran back to the kitchen, coming out with food for the brothers. "Well, I'm glad you could make it. We missed you yesterday," Thatch said, making Sabou feel a bit uncomfortable at the mention of their bad day yesterday. "Ah, yeah, sorry about that. We were a bit out of it yesterday. Didn't get enough sleep I guess," Sabou explained, quickly eating to get himself out of the conversation. Thatch nodded in understanding, sitting down and picking up his fork. "That's understandable. Well, anyway, we're all glad you're feeling better then," Thatch said, waving his arms out to gesture to the few other commanders who were at the table with them. Seeing his breakfast was only just finished, there was only a handful of commanders there, the ones who usually got there early. Izo, Marco, and Jozu all nodded in agreement with Thatch's previous statement, all with food of their own. Ace and Luffy were back to being on guard during breakfast, the crowd of pirates slowly filing into the room until nearly everyone was there. The rest of the commanders and the captain were here as well now, everyone having their usual, joyful conversations while the trio tried to stay as out of the way as possible, not wanting to get involved in any conversations. As they did this though, Sabou remembered how he had wanted to thank Thatch for giving them food yesterday when they didn't show up for meals. Waiting for a chance where the chef wasn't talking or being called back into the kitchen, Sabou finally spoke up. "By the way, Mr. Chef," Sabou piped up eventually, drawing his brother's attention. They hadn't expected Sabou to initiate any conversations, and from the looks of it, Thatch hadn't either. "Really, just Thatch is fine. What's up?" Thatch asked, turning his attention to the blonde. The brothers were just finishing their breakfast, so Sabou found this was the best time to have this conversation. If they needed to leave, they could. "We just wanted to thank you for giving us food yesterday, seeing as we didn't come here to eat," Sabou said with a genuinely grateful tone. Realizing what Sabou was talking about, Ace and Luffy relaxed, both nodding their thanks to the man as well, who still looked a bit surprised. "Oh, that? It was no big deal. Besides, as long as you're on the Moby you're not gonna go hungry." "Not when I'm your chef," Thatch boasted proudly with a smile. Sabou smiled at the thought. nodding to the happy chef as some of the commanders laughed around them at Thatch's antics. "Wait, so how did you know it was me?" Thatch asked after the laughter died down. "Ah," Sabou started, he and his brothers standing up, getting ready to leave. "You have loud footsteps," Sabou said, flashing the chef a smile, waving as they walked away, leaving a confused chef behind. "They're not that loud, are they?" "Nay, Fosa, do I have loud footsteps?" Sabou snickered to himself, Ace smiling and Luffy much more relaxed than he had been so far on this ship. It was true though, out of all the people on this ship Sabou had noticed that Thatch's footsteps were a bit heavier and louder than most, making it easy to identify the man whenever he walked by. Now that they were done with breakfast and feeling much better than they had yesterday, the brothers decided to do a bit of exploring. Even though they never finished that tour with Izo, they didn't want to bother the man who was still eating breakfast, so they decided to just walk around and see what they could find inside the Moby. The trio had only really gone through the hallway where their room was, and although Ace and Sabou had explored a bit when looking for Luffy when he ran off, they hadn't been paying much attention. Seeing as everyone was in the galley, the three didn't see any harm in speaking aloud, especially since Sabou would be able to hear anyone coming. The three talked about mindless things for a while until Sabou remembered Luffy's penchant for nicknaming the commanders. "By the way, Luffy, you should at least learn the names of the commanders," Sabou said after Luffy once again mentioned Marco by using the nickname Lazy Face as they walked. Luffy pouted, clearly unhappy with what Sabou had just suggested. "But those are their names," Luffy whined, crossing his arms where he stood in between Ace and Sabou. "No, they aren't, Lou. They're weird nicknames that you made up." Ace deadpanned, causing Luffy to pout further. "So what if they are? They're easier to remember," Luffy mumbled, kicking his foot against the ground. Sabou sighed, shaking his head. "Yes, but sometimes your nicknames can make people a little unhappy, even if you don't think they would." Sabou tried explaining, knowing that Luffy meant no harm in his nicknames, but sometimes they could be taken offensively to the people he said them to. "What do you mean?" the youngest asked, confused. "You know how you get mad whenever Shanks calls you Anchor?" Ace asked, Luffy nodding. "Yeah, it's not my fault I sink," Luffy said, remembering the nickname, Ace Helding. "See, that nickname upsets you, just like some of your nicknames upset others, even if you don't realize it," Ace said, Luffy finally seeming to understand. "Oh, I get it now. So I should learn their names then," Luffy said determinedly, Sabou smiling gratefully to Ace, to which the eldest gave a smug smile back. "That's right, Lou, for starters, Marco's the first commander, not Lazy Face," Sabou said, Luffy frowning as he tried to remember the name, nodding. "I still think Lazy Face is better though," Luffy mumbled after a minute, causing Ace to laugh. Sabou glared at him. "You're not helping Ace. I know you might think it's better Lou, but that's not his name, it's Marco," Sabou said again, saying the name slowly in hopes that his brother would catch on to the name and stick to it. And that's how the conversation went. As they familiarized themselves with the inside of the Moby, Sabou taught Luffy a few of the commanders' names, the ones they normally talked to, like Thatch, Marco, Izo, and Namur. He let Haruda's nickname slide for obvious reasons. By now breakfast was over and they were passing more and more pirates, so the brothers decided to talk silently rather than out loud as they explored. The Moby was definitely big and they were getting a bit tired and disoriented after everything they'd explored so far, so they decided to try and find their way back to the deck. Luffy using his sense of smell while Sabou used his hearing, and Ace kept an eye out for anything weird. When they finally reached the deck, Ace and Sabou were about to head to the railing when Luffy stopped them, tilting his head as he stared across the deck. "What is it, Lou?" Sabou asked, looking across the deck to try and figure out what Luffy was looking at. Ace did the same, waiting for a response. "Can we go near Big Mustache, Captain?" Luffy asked, staring at the giant captain. Ace and Sabou raised an eyebrow at that, glancing at each other. "You want to go near the captain?" Ace asked for clarification. Luffy looked hesitant, eyebrows scrunching in thought. "No, but he has a lot of warm feelings and no one else has had warm feelings besides Ace and Sabou," Luffy said, having been curious about that since he first figured out that the captain contained a lot of the warm feeling. The two oldest seemed hesitant, but they were also curious about that as well. None of them had figured out how someone felt the warm feeling, but none of the doctors had had it. After a while, Ace and Sabou had been able to figure out how to send that feeling to Luffy to calm him down, but that had taken a lot of trial and error and a lot of meditating to help them figure out where the feeling was coming from in the first place, so for the captain to have such an abundance of it was a bit confusing. "As long as you don't let the warm feeling influence yourself too much," Sabou said, Luffy nodding in agreement. With that said, the three made their way along the railing, towards the captain but not getting too close. They eventually sat on the railing in their usual position some feet away from the captain, close enough that they could easily see him, but not close enough that the man could reach them if he tried. The pirates noticed the brothers' change in location but said nothing, opting to instead give them curious stares as they went on with their duties. The trio ignored them though, Sabou pretending to look at the clouds with Luffy again while Luffy started trying to decipher the captain's feelings. He couldn't find even a hint of any bad feelings in the man, no anger, frustration, annoyance, not even a feeling of being tired. The only thing that the captain was feeling were happy feelings, joy, pride, contentment, love, and of course the warm feeling. It confused Luffy because these were pirates, and he had never felt anyone feel these feelings without the slimy greed behind all of them. Luffy let himself take in just a small bit of the warmth that the captain was sending out, amazed when even that much made him want to feel more. He remembered what Sabou said though and forced himself to stop, instead trying to focus on the other feelings, searching as far as he could for even a hint of dark feelings, because surely no one else but his brothers could feel only good emotions, right? The captain was an enigma to Luffy, a puzzle he couldn't solve, something too good to be true. He decided to take down one of his walls to see if the captain's soul had changed color at all, looking for even a trace of gray in the vastly blue aura. Finding none, the straw-hatted teen slumped a bit, not understanding. Were his powers defective? Surely these pirates weren't all nice? Maybe the doctors had messed up and he only saw a few people's true feelings. Maybe he only saw happy feelings in people he'd never met before. He didn't have any explanation for what was happening, because the captain couldn't possibly be this good of a person, right? Mind made up, Luffy jumped down from the railing, ignoring the shock and surprise coming from Ace and Sabou as they both got to their feet as well, moving closer to him. Determined, Luffy walked down the stairs into Whitebeard's amphitheater-like zone and looked up at the giant. He could feel the worry rolling off of Ace and Sabou but again chose to ignore it. He could even hear them tapping to him, telling him to stop whatever he was about to do, to not anger the captain. By now all eyes were on them, everyone curious as to what was happening, because, by the looks of it, Ace and Sabou had no idea either. Only Luffy, who was staring at Whitebeard with narrowed eyes, seemed to know what was happening. Ace and Sabou had no idea what Luffy was planning, and they didn't want to find out. They hadn't been expecting the timid and anxious boy to suddenly stalk up to the giant pirate captain without a word to them. Ever since everything that happened in the facility, Luffy had been much more wary of strangers, but seeing him now reminded them of 7 years ago, before any of the hell that was the facility happened. But what had caused this? Had Luffy felt the bad feeling? If he had, they had a feeling he wouldn't have reacted in this way, or he at least would have told them before doing this. Nay, giant mustache captain. Inwardly, Sabou cursed for not teaching Luffy the captain's name, but how was he supposed to have predicted that the boy would go and do this? Luffy. Ace hissed so low and quiet that Sabou wasn't even sure if Luffy heard, the fire user shuffling closer to Luffy as he did. Luffy had to have heard it though, because his eyes flitted over to Ace for a brief moment before he promptly ignored the oldest, turning back to face Whitebeard with his narrowed eyes. Yes? Whitebeard asked, obviously curious as to what was happening as well, and Sabou just hoped that Luffy wouldn't get them into any trouble. If ever there was a time for the brothers to be worried about the pirates turning on them, it would be now. Your mustache is stupid. The bluntness of the statement made everyone blink, not having expected the youngest to say that of all things. Luffy. This time it was Sabou who hissed, but before he could turn to apologize to the captain he was interrupted. Gararara, you're a cheeky brat, huh? Whitebeard asked, a grin on his face. But Ace and Sabou for the life of them couldn't figure out if there was any ill intent behind it. In any case, they shuffled closer to Luffy, grabbing his hands tightly in theirs. Luffy didn't reply, instead staring at Whitebeard for a moment with the same narrowed eyes and determined look. I bet I could beat you. Again, the bluntness threw everyone for a loop, and Ace and Sabou's stomachs continued to drop more and more, wondering if Luffy was trying to get the captain to attack them. Again Whitebeard laughed in response, leaving Sabou with no chance to try and explain Luffy's actions, not that he could even if he had the chance. Oh, I think you're 100 years too soon to be challenging me, Whitebeard said confidently, his smile never leaving his face. Still, Luffy wasn't fazed by the answer, once Beard for a moment before speaking up again. How do you feel about family? Once more, the bluntness of the question caught everyone off guard. There seemed to be no pattern to the questions Luffy was asking, no reason for them. They were completely random and no one could figure out what was going on in the boy's head, not even his brothers who merely stood by, watching. They knew they should stop Luffy from speaking anymore, but the determination showed that, obviously, Luffy was trying to figure something out, and whatever it was probably important, so they let him ask the questions, just hoping that this wouldn't be the moment they had to jump ship. They still hadn't found where they kept lifeboats. Family, you say? Family looks out for each other, keeps each other safe. You don't hurt or betray family. You don't turn away from family. Whitebeard answered easily, raising an eyebrow now at Luffy's questions, and Ace and Sabou hoped that didn't mean he was starting to get annoyed with the youngest's pestering. And everyone on the crew is family? Luffy asked, furthering the conversation. Whitebeard nodded, face serious. Everyone on my ship is my sons and daughters. We're all a family. Whitebeard confirmed. Luffy went silent again, everyone watching, waiting for his next question, not knowing what to expect next. Eventually, Luffy grinned his large toothy smile that was rare these days, only shown to the brothers when they were in the safety of their room, away from prying eyes. She, you're a good guy, Whitebeard. Luffy said, still grinning as he turned to walk back to the railing, though it was the railing much closer to the captain, clearly not trying to distance himself anymore. Ace and Sabou looked at each other in a mixture of shock and confusion. They had no idea what the purpose behind Luffy's actions was, nor how those questions deemed the captain a good guy, but they followed Luffy back to the railing silently, ignoring any looks they could feel coming from the pirates. Luffy was back to facing the ocean as Ace and Sabou reached him. Sabou sitting beside him while Ace took his position on the ground, listening for the taps he knew were to come. Luffy? Sabou questioned almost hesitantly. The boy, who was smiling brightly, glanced at Sabou out of the corner of his eye, acknowledging that he had heard him. What was that all about? Sabou asked, wanting more than anything to figure out what had just happened. Luffy's smile widened even more as he turned his eyes back to the ocean, holding back laughter. Shanks and Ji-chan were right, giant mustache captain's a good guy. Luffy said though, that did nothing to explain what had happened or how he had figured this information out. What's that got to do with what just happened? Ace questioned from the floor, tapping just loud enough for Luffy to hear. I was checking to see if he was a good guy. Bad guys don't have so many good feelings. Luffy replied, still smiling. Sabou and Ace both felt even more confused. You deemed him a good guy because he was feeling happy? Ace asked incredulously. Luffy tilted his head, as if unsure of how to answer that. No. But yeah. But no, Luffy said, a bit confused himself now. Sabou resisted the urge to facepalm. Then explain to us what happened. Sabou resolved, wanting to move forward with the conversation. Luffy nodded at that, thinking of how to explain it. Well, I was feeling giant mustache's feelings because only Ace and Sabou have had the warm feeling, but he had a lot too, so I was confused. I checked his other feelings and there weren't any bad feelings, not even anger or sleepiness, so when I asked him questions I tried to make him mad, but it didn't work, so that's why he was a good guy. Luffy tried explaining, though his brothers were still confused. Wait, what do you mean he didn't get mad? Not even a bit? Ace asked, thinking back to some of the questions. Sure, Luffy's insult had been kind of lame, but it was still an insult, and his challenge should have been a surefire way to get a pirate captain ready for a fight. It was the perfect excuse, so why hadn't the captain even felt an inkling of wanting to fight them? Was he that confident he would win that it didn't matter to him? Nope, he didn't get mad, he was only interested and a bit confused, and when I asked him about family he didn't lie to me. He meant everything he said, so he's a good guy. I like him. Luffy determined, smiling again. Ace and Sabou went quiet a moment, both thinking over Luffy's words. They had already felt a bit more comfortable near the captain over all the other pirates, purely because of the fact that the man exuded a lot of the warmth. They hadn't known anyone else who had it, so that was a good sign to the brothers, but now that Luffy was so confidently claiming the man to be a good person, it made Ace and Sabou that much more inclined to like the man. It also helped that, even when presented with the perfect opportunity, Whitebeard hadn't fought their brother. He'd had the perfect opportunity to get rid of one of the brothers at that moment, yet he hadn't done anything, choosing to laugh it off instead. Both of them glanced to the captain, realizing some of the pirates were still watching them, very clearly still wondering about what had happened. A while passed since Luffy's interrogation of Whitebeard, and the pirates were finally beginning to disperse, allowing the brothers to relax a bit. As usual, it didn't last long though, Ace spotting the first commander making his way over to them. After informing Sabou and Luffy of the incoming commander, Ace sat up slightly, making it look as if he was waking up, stretching a bit before letting his eyes flick over to Marco fully now. It didn't take long for him to reach the brothers, Sabou and Luffy turning around to face him as well. Hello Marco, how are you? Sabou asked politely, smiling to the man. Good, thank you, Yoi, Marco replied. Luffy began trying to get a read on the man, hoping to figure out why he came to talk to them in the first place. Like Whitebeard before he interrogated him, Luffy felt a bit more comfortable near the first commander, Thatch as well, because both of them had helped him save his brothers, and he knew that both of them kept their promises, but he had to be sure, like he was with Whitebeard, that he was really a good person. So what is it you needed? Sabou asked, making himself comfortable as he gave his attention over to Marco. Nothing much, I just came by to tell you all that we're on course to an island that we should reach sometime tomorrow. We figured we could restock and get you some necessities like clothes, Yoi, seeing as you'll be staying with us now. Marco explained. The three perked at the thought of being able to go onto land soon, and maybe even away from the pirates for a bit. Anything else? Sabou asked, wondering if the man would bring up Luffy's stunt earlier. The commander shook his head though, surprising Sabou a bit, having expected him to try and pry the answer out of them, or at least question it a bit, but that wasn't the case. No, that was all, Yoi. You three won't have to do chores until next month when we get the new schedule made, so until then you guys can just rela. Marco cut himself off when Ace, who had been sitting up straight, arms crossed over his chest, suddenly slumped back against the railing, arms falling at his side. Of course Ace would have a sleep attack now of all times. A few pirates turned to see what the thump noise Ace had made was. But Sabo had more pressing issues, namely the commander who had just seen Ace have a sleep attack mid-conversation. "Ah, don't worry about him, he gets bored easily and has a knack for falling asleep whenever and wherever he wants." Sabo lied, hoping the commander wouldn't question it any more than that. Luffy seemed a bit worried as well, shifting a bit beside Sabo on the railing, looking like he wanted to move closer to Ace, to make sure no one got too close to him now that he was defenseless. Sabo felt the same. "Are you like he hit the rail pretty hard there? I can get whiskey if you want," Marco said, a hint of concern in his voice, contrasting his outwardly bored-looking appearance, though his eyebrow was a bit more raised now. Sabo had to bite his tongue from screaming that, no, they would not like for him to get whiskey, a nurse, to check up on their brother right now. Stopping himself though he forced a smile, hoping he looked unfazed by the question. "He's fine, he's got a thick skull, something like that wouldn't hurt him," Sabo said, trying to smile pleasantly to the man. Marco looked at Ace another minute before he turned back to Sabo, seemingly accepting the answer to which Sabo nearly sighed in relief. They wrapped the conversation up quickly after that, the commander leaving just as Ace began to wake up again, the same dazed look on his face that he usually had whenever he had a sleep attack. Sabo quickly recapped everything that had happened before they left, deciding to go take a nap. Obviously, Ace's attacks weren't going to get better after only one night of good sleep, but Sabo had hoped he wouldn't have to deal with him falling asleep so obviously in front of the first commander of all people. Well, at least he hadn't been standing when it happened, that would have been a lot harder to explain. Chapter 37. The first island of, hopefully, many. By the time the next day rolled around, the brothers were more than ready to go onto an island. Marco had told them over lunch that he and Izo would take them out to do the shopping for anything they would need, but after that, they were free to roam the island if they wanted. Breakfast passed by smoothly, and after, the brothers went out onto the deck, sitting where they had yesterday. It was closed by Whitebeard, which, once again, did not go unnoticed by the pirates, nor the captain. They ignored them though, opting instead to watch the island that they could faintly see in the distance slowly get closer. Ace had no problem seeing it, and for once, instead of sitting on the ground, Ace leaned over the railing with his brothers, Sabo taking charge of listening for anyone getting too close. "The trees are pretty tall, and from what I can see the town's not that big, so that means there's a lot of forest to explore," Ace said, speaking softly to Sabo and Luffy, describing the details that he could see with his enhanced eyesight. Even though the younger two could only see a speck that resembled an island, Ace could see much more detail, and Luffy, curious as ever, wanted to know what it looked like so far. "Really, Sabo, we can go exploring, right?" Luffy asked, turning to Sabo with a bright smile and shining eyes. Sabo briefly paused in focusing on the pirates surrounding them and turned to Luffy, smiling back. "We can, Luffy, but only after we do some shopping first, remember?" Sabo asked, all three of them still speaking in hushed tones. Even though it would be easier to speak in their silent language, it would mean that Sabo wouldn't be able to focus all that much on their surroundings. If he was focusing on the pirates, he wouldn't be able to take the time to decipher the different taps they used in their language, and if he focused on the taps, then he might miss someone coming. "What else is there, Ace?" Luffy asked, pleased by Sabo's response. Ace continued to describe different things that he could see to Luffy, how the buildings looked, how many people he could see, the different boats in the docks, even what color flowers were in one of the window sills. Luffy took all of it in, hanging on to every word, but when Sabo signaled that Thatch was coming over, their conversation stopped, all of them turning to face the incoming chef. "Hey boys, you excited to visit the island?" Thatch asked pleasantly, a smile on his face. Sabo smiled back, nodding to the man as he did, while Luffy began reading his feelings. "We are. We've only ever been to our home island before," Sabo said, deciding that the island that the facility had been on hadn't counted. Thatch nodded in understanding, walking up to the railing so that he could look at the now much more visible island. "Makes sense. That just makes it all the more exciting though," Thatch said, smile widening. "I wish I could go with you guys though, but I'm in charge of restocking the food supply," Thatch continued, sighing a bit as he lit a cigarette. "Oh well, I guess there's always next time. Maybe I'll see you guys after," Thatch said, standing and giving them a grin before waving and walking off, saying a quick goodbye as the three watched in confusion. They hadn't really said a word to the man, the chef just continuing the conversation with himself, like a monologue that they had accidentally overheard. "That was weird," Ace muttered quietly, Sabo nodding in agreement. "Well, whatever it was, at least I didn't have to do much talking," Sabo said as he turned back around on the railing, looking back to the island. Ace and Luffy turned as well, the island much closer than it had been when they first started looking at it. "We should probably go find Marco or Izo, everyone's getting ready to land soon," Sabo said, hearing everyone talking, some giving orders on what to do as they got closer to the island. Ace and Luffy nodded, the trio turning away from the railing and looking at the mass of people. Luffy discreetly sniffed the air, sifting through the many scents until he found the familiar trail that would lead them to the first commander. "This way," Luffy signaled, turning to walk towards the upper deck. His brothers followed, trusting Luffy's nose. It wasn't hard to find the commander after that, the the three easily identifying the unique haircut as they ascended the stairs. Marco was talking to someone, but by the time they reached the top of the stairs the conversation seemed to be over, the other pirate walking away while Marco stayed where he was, glancing around at everyone else around them. Seeing this as the perfect time, the brothers walked up to the man, the commander spotting them quickly as they did. "Ready to go, Yoi?" Marco asked, Sabou nodding. "We saw everyone was getting ready, so we decided to come find you or Izo, seeing as we'll be going with you too," Sabou explained smoothly. "We should be landing within a couple of minutes now. After that, we'll wait for Oyaji to give out the assigned tasks, but then we'll be all set, Yoi," Marco said. "Do you need any help with anything?" Sabou asked, feeling a bit bad as he watched everyone working around them, some getting ready to lower the anchor, others heading to get the gangplank. Marco seemed to think for a second before nodding. "If you want, could you go and tell Izo that I need him to go and separate the money for the different groups being sent out to restock?" "I would, but I'm a bit busy making sure we don't crash into the island, Yoi," Marco said, and there was a hint of exasperation behind his words as if this was something that could happen if he weren't here. The task seemed simple enough, so Sabou nodded, Marco thanking them as he told them where the man might be, not that they needed it. The three turned to leave, Luffy using the time to smell the air for Izo, finding the perfume scent easily over the others. Apparently, the man had just come out on deck, the wind blowing the scent right to him. The three maneuvered their way through the throngs of pirates bustling around, Luffy holding onto his brother's hands as he led them so they wouldn't be separated on accident. Once they reached the man, Sabou took charge again, putting on a smile as he called the man's name. "Oh, hello you three, can I help you?" Izo asked, looking a bit surprised that they were talking to him. "Marco wanted us to ask you if you could go separate the money for everyone going out to restock," Sabou said, relaying the information with ease. Izo sighed, smoothing his kimono out a bit. "And right after I just left too. Well, thank you for the information, I'll see you guys in a bit," Izo said, smiling pleasantly to them as he turned to head back where he had come from. "Well, now what?" Ace asked as they watched the door close behind the 16th commander. Sabou shrugged. "Guess we just wait," and they did. They watched as the pirates bustled back and forth, listening to, or giving, commands as they went. Not wanting to get in the way, the three sat on the sidelines, letting the experienced pirates take care of it all. Besides, there was so much going on that the brothers were a bit uncomfortable being near everyone during it. They didn't like that, at any second, someone could turn and attack them, because with all the movement going on, this would be a perfect time, it would catch them off guard. The three weren't anywhere near trusting these pirates, if they ever would. Sure, they were a bit more comfortable near some, i.e. Whitebeard, Marco, Thatch, and Izo, but even then it was more that they tolerated being near those people better than they did the others on this ship, many who were still complete strangers. It was also a case of the brothers not wanting to try and get close to anyone, because what if they found out about them and their past and turned on them? It would hurt if they were strangers, but if they grew close with them, trusted them, it would hurt even more, and they couldn't handle that, not when the facility was such a fresh wound. Finally, though, all the preparations slowing as things worked themselves out, the Moby successfully anchoring and the gangplank being laid down onto the dock. The pirates gathered around Whitebeard and the trio guessed this was when everyone would be assigned their jobs. They decided to stay on the railing, watching Marco and Izo so they would be ready to go when they were done. Whitebeard gave out the assignments, and when he finished the brothers hopped down, walking over to their escorts for the day. "Alright, let's get going," Izo said with a smile, holding a pouch of what was, presumably, money. The three nodded, following the commanders off the ship and onto the solid ground, their legs a bit shaky after getting used to the rocky ship. They righted themselves easily though, following quickly, not wanting to get left behind or lost. "So we should go get your clothes first, and then anything else after that. There'll probably be a bit of spending money left so you three can use it however you want, but after that, you can go explore," Izo said, glancing around to find the shops they would need. Sabou nodded, listening carefully so he knew what they were doing and where they should be going. "And don't worry about the money, we've got it covered. Once you three start doing chores you'll get your own allowance to use on whatever you like whenever we dock," Izo explained. While Sabou listened to the commander, Luffy was practically bouncing with joy, looking at all the different shops, smelling the different smells, feeling the happy feelings coming from many of the citizens. Even though he didn't want to get too close to anyone, he was content sticking in between Ace and Sabou and observing from there. He may be different from 7 years ago, but his childish wonder and curiosity was still the same. Ace had to hold onto Luffy's hand a bit too tightly to keep the youngest from running off towards the first smell of food, but other than that the oldest was enjoying the excursion as well. He was glancing around, using his vision to look into the forest at the edge of the town, seeing it extend a good distance in, meaning it was big and perfect for exploring. After they put up with being a bit too close to a lot of new people, the three brothers would be able to finally relax by themselves in the forest. "This looks like the one we want, Yoi," Marco announced, breaking Ace and Luffy from their thoughts. They followed the two into the shop, looking around at all the different clothes. Izo was beaming as he practically floated away towards a shelf where he began browsing. Marco shook his head, turning to the brothers.
Go get anything you want, I'll just wait here, yoi. Oh, and you might want to hurry before Izo tries to get you to try on 20 different shirts. Marco said, the three nodding as they went off to a different section of the store.
That guy can try, but I swear, if he does I'll throw the shirt right back at him. Ace tapped, not wanting to play dress up. He wanted to get this over with as soon as possible. Sabou rolled his eyes, already lifting different shirts and pants up to Luffy to check if they would fit the small boy. Not a good plan, we're trying to be nice, remember? Sabou asked after putting back a shirt that was a bit too big for Luffy. Ace pouted. Fine, I'll throw it back gently. Happy? Ace asked, crossing his arms as he tapped against his skin. Sabou sent a pointed look to Ace, frowning but didn't say anything. I like pretty man. He's feeling really happy right now, Luffy tapped, a smile blossoming onto his face, and his brothers realized that, even though most of it was probably his own emotion, Luffy was probably being influenced by the overjoyed man stacking clothes over his arm. That wasn't an entirely bad thing though, because at least it was a happy emotion. Sabou smiled to Luffy, ruffling his hair. That's good Lou, he seems to be a nice person at least, Sabou said, meaning it. Izo hadn't done anything to them that would raise any flags. He had even helped Luffy with his hat, which was definitely a plus. Now, Ace, try this on, Sabou said, tossing the shirt at Ace, the clothing covering the fire user's face. Ace pulled it off, revealing a glare while Luffy snickered beside him. Meanwhile, Marco watched from where he stood at the front of the shop. Izo was flitting around, clearly pleased with the situation he was in as he stacked shirts upon shirts, sometimes adding pants to the mix as he did. Marco knew he was going to have to stop the man before he ended up trying to buy the whole store, but for now, he would let his brother have his fun. The trio of brothers, on the other hand, were a bit more interesting to watch. Sabou was helping Luffy pick out clothes, more like picking them out himself, while Ace watched, looking a bit annoyed. At one point Sabou threw a shirt at the oldest, confusing Marco a bit, but it made Luffy laugh, which wasn't something he heard much at all. After that Ace began helping with the process, taking over the role of getting clothes for Luffy while Sabou moved on to getting clothes for himself and Ace. It was interesting to watch the brothers work. They still knew next to nothing about them, like what had happened in the facility, what information the facility had gotten on the three that made the Marines want them back so bad, or even something as mundane as their favorite food. But Marco knew that they wouldn't be getting any of that information anytime soon, and that was okay. Luffy's interrogation of Oyaji had been a bit strange, and no one knew what to make of it when it had happened. Marco recalled that even Ace and Sabou seemed surprised by Luffy's questionnaire, which only made it all that much more confusing. But Marco had decided not to bring it up at the time, because Sabou had looked like he expected him to, and he knew how touchy the three were about sharing information, so he had chosen not to pry. Of course, everyone else had thought he had pried because the second he left the brothers he was bombarded by questions from anyone he saw, all of them wanting to know what the deal was. The brothers were a puzzle that was rapidly increasing in difficulty, and Marco was beginning to wonder if they would ever get closer to solving it. But after the interrogation from Luffy, the three seemed to be a bit more comfortable near their captain, so that had to be a good sign, right? The first commander watched the brothers, noticing that every few seconds one of them would tap, either on their arms, legs, shelves, or even each other, and Marco was reminded of the many other times he had seen them do that. He raised an eyebrow at the gesture, still not knowing what to make of it.
Initially, he had thought that it might be a nervous tic or a habit, but for them to do it that frequently as if there was purpose behind it, made him think otherwise. He didn't know what it would mean otherwise, but he did know that there had to be some kind of story behind it.
Eventually, it looked like the three were finished, each holding their own stack of clothing. Marco stood up from where he was leaning against the wall and grabbed the pouch of money from his side, having confiscated it from Izo the second they reached the store. You guys done, yoi? Sabou nodded at the question, following the man over to the checkout where a woman was smiling politely to them. The brothers ignored the pleasantries from the woman, instead more focused on what they had been discussing earlier. But what if there was such thing as an underwater tiger? Luffy asked. And I told you, there's no way there's freaking underwater tigers, they don't exist, Ace said, this argument having been going on for most of their shopping experience now. But what if they were? Luffy pressed, only annoying Ace more. Alright, both of you calm down, Marco's finishing. Sabou interjected, drawing their attention back to their chaperone who was beginning to pick up one of their bags. Ace grabbed the other two before the commander had a chance and they began heading to the front of the store. We're leaving now, Izo, Marin to look to see if the other commander heard. There was a groan, indicating that Izo had, in fact, heard him, and the brothers turned to see the man quickly returning clothes to their shelves before running after them. Marco, you did that on purpose. You could have given me some warning, Izo whined, frowning. Marco rolled his eyes at that. If I had, yoi, you would have bought something. This trip wasn't meant for you to restock your endless wardrobe. Remember? Marco asked, raising an eyebrow to the man who promptly pouted, placing his arms in his sleeves. Yeah, but you could have at least let me get that one shirt. It would have been great for Rikuyo. He's always complaining he doesn't have a shirt with shorter sleeves for when we go to the summer islands, Izo said, a slight whine still in his voice. Then you should come back later with Rikuyo, Yoi, Marco said. The brothers watched the interaction with mild interest, the two going back and forth with ease. Even though they hung around the pirates, they never paid too much to how they interacted, always assuming it was like the doctors had interacted with each other, calm, cool, and professional, only saying what was needed and then being done. This, however, was different, a much easier, laid-back conversation that they hadn't been expecting. After Izo and Marco finished up their talk, the group lapsed into silence, walking through the town and admiring the beauty of it all as they did. Luffy was becoming a bit more comfortable and relaxed in their group, pleased that no one was coming up to bother them, and had eventually begun to speak aloud, pointing to different buildings that interested him or products he thought looked cool. Ace and Sabo indulged him, agreeing that, yes, that shop was really tall, or yes, that jacket with the spikes on the shoulders looked cool. The group had been walking for a couple of minutes, the shop they were looking for not close to where they had been, and at one point Luffy had directed Ace and Sabo attention towards a building on their left. Just as he raised his arm, ready to blurt out whatever it was that was on his mind, Marco suddenly grabbed the boy's wrist, shocking him into silence. Ace and Sabo almost immediately began to jump into action, not knowing why Marco had just grabbed Luffy, and not really caring. All they knew was that they weren't going to let the man hurt their brother. Were the pirates finally turning? Was this the moment they had been waiting for? Let's go look at that over there, Yoi, Marco said almost a little too quickly, lowering Luffy's arm as he pulled him onto the opposite side of the street, leading them back toward the way they had come. Ace and Sabo were just about to pull Marco off of their brother, just about to attack him when they heard Marco speak in a much quieter tone than before. Just follow me, Marines are coming this way, Yoi, Marco said softly, probably having noticed the tension in all three of them. Luffy, who had looked particularly terrified that Marco had grabbed his arm, looked even more scared after hearing those words, pulling his arm closer to his side, Marco having let it go by now. Ace and Sabo almost froze in shock, realizing now exactly what had happened. They rushed forward toward Luffy, putting him in between them once more as they tucked their own arm a bit closer to their sides. Marco had covered Luffy's tattoo from the Marine, who would have surely seen it had Marco let the boy continue with what he had been doing. Izo was following behind them, and for once they didn't care, as long as they got away from the Marine. They were silent again, and Ace and Sabo were silently cursing themselves, mad that they hadn't been paying as much attention as they should have. Of course, there would be Marines here, ones that probably knew to look out for children with numbers on their wrists, and they were walking around showing theirs off to the whole world. Sabo risked a quick glance behind him, catching sight of the familiar white and blue outfit that indicated a Marine, and quickly looked forward again, biting the inside of his cheek as he felt the anxiety begin to well up inside him. Luffy, already shaken from Marco's sudden contact, was even more shaken by the close proximity they were in to the Marine, wanting more than anything to go hide in their room back on the Moby, or near the giant captain, the one who always had so much warmth radiating from him. Instead, he grabbed onto Ace and Sabo's hands, pulling them close to him so he could feel their arms on his, using the contact to ground himself, to feel safer. Ace was trying to look anywhere but behind him, not wanting to look at the Marine and risk gaining their attention, but wanting to know how close they were, if they were already looking at him and his brothers, wanting to see where they were headed.
Were they going to follow them? Would they turn off towards another section of town? Had he already seen their tattoos? Ace bristled at the thought, clenching his fist tightly, his fingernails digging into his palm to the point that they were nearly drawing blood. He forced himself to keep his eyes straight ahead, forced himself to follow the first commander who was definitely high up on his suspicion list. Even though the man had only been doing it to help the brothers, it was still off-putting that he had so quickly grabbed Luffy and could have hurt him in the few seconds that Ace and Sabo hadn't reacted. They had gotten lucky, and next time someone grabbed Luffy like that, it probably wasn't going to be with good intentions. Next time they would have to be more prepared. They couldn't risk letting their guard down like they had in the town. They had gotten too comfortable, forgotten about the dangers that surrounded them at every turn, too excited about the prospect of finally being alone for a bit after all of this. With those thoughts in mind, the brothers followed Marco as he led them back through the town, using different turns to get them back to where they needed to be without going by the Marine. Now that they knew they weren't near a Marine, the three calmed slightly, but they were nowhere near back to being as relaxed as they had been previously, and they didn't think they would. Anything else we'll need will be in here, Yoi, Marco said eventually as they finally reached the shop they needed. Ace, Sabo, and Luffy nodded mutely, following him inside and grabbing things almost mechanically, not really paying much attention to the items like they would normally. They couldn't help but focus on everyone around them, waiting for the next attack, waiting for someone to make their move, for Marines to come swarming in. Apparently, they had gotten everything they needed because before they knew it they were walking up to the cashier, Marco paying for their things and Sabo grabbing the bags. The group left the shop and began making their way back to the Moby to put their things away. After we get your things back you're free to roam the island if you would like, but be careful you three, we don't want the Marines spotting you, Izo said, worry evident on his face as he spoke, concerned for the three. Sabou nodded, barely listening as he focused more on their surroundings, wanting to be ready for anything. Izo sighed, noticing the lack of attention, the trio still looking a bit shaken up.
Izo couldn't blame them, they had only just gotten out of that facility, and they were already being faced with people who wanted to send them back. No matter the fact that he, and everyone else on the Mobi, knew nothing about their past, they knew it was bad. Marco was feeling the same, but he also felt a bit bad that he had startled the brothers in the first place. He hadn't noticed the Marine coming until it was too late, and in an effort to keep the boys safe he had to grab the youngest's arm to keep them from being caught, but as a result, it had put the brothers on edge. It was better for them to be mad at him than for the Marine to spot them, but it was a bit disappointing after they had all been the brothers that they could trust the Whitebeards, and he had gone and nearly ruined it if he hadn't already. Once they reached the ship the trio made a beeline for their room, bags in hand as they did, while Izo and Marco went to Whitebeard to tell him about what happened. They didn't know if the brothers would still be going out to the island after this, but it might be a good idea to have someone go with them just in case. "Welcome back my sons, how was your outing?" Whitebeard asked as he saw the two commanders walking up to him. Izo sighed, rubbing the back of his head. "Well, it could have been better," Izo admitted, Whitebeard raising an eyebrow.
"Oh, did something happen?" Whitebeard asked. "We almost ran into a Marine, Yoi," Marco explained, sighing as well. Whitebeard frowned in understanding. "How are the brats?" the captain asked, concerned for the three he had taken in. Izo tilted his head, turning to look at the door leading to the boys' room. "I think they're still a bit shaken up." Marco scared him a bit too, Izo said, glancing at the commander. Even though he understood why Marco did it, he knew that it had caused the boys a bit of extra stress. "The Marine would have seen Luffy's tattoo so I had to grab his wrist to stop him, Yoi." The brothers didn't know there was a Marine though and probably thought the worst. Marco said in response to his captain's raised eyebrow. Before Whitebeard could respond though the door was opening and the brothers were walking out, as silent as ever, walking over to the gangplank and making their way back onto the island. "I thought for sure they wouldn't want to go back onto the island," Izo mumbled quietly as he watched the three walk towards the forest rather than the town. "Should I go after them Oyaji, Yoi?" Marco asked, also watching the three leave. Whitebeard was silent for a second but shook his head. "Leave them be for now. If they're not back in an hour go check on them and make sure they haven't been harmed," Whitebeard said, concerned for the brothers' safety, but not wanting to force them to have a guard with them everywhere they went. It seemed that after the outing today whatever progress the pirates had made had gone back down again. Whitebeard grinned. It was one step forward and two steps back with these brothers. "Finally, it feels like I can breathe again," Ace sighed, shoulders relaxing as the trees surrounded them on all sides, not sensing anyone near them with his haki. They were finally alone. "Look at how tall the trees are," Luffy said in amazement, also feeling more relaxed now that there was no one around to hurt him or his brothers. "It's almost like the jungle back home," Sabou said as he looked around, having the urge to go jumping through the trees like they had done so long ago. They may not be kids anymore on their home island, but they still enjoyed running around and being free like they had back then. "Nay, Ace, Sabou, I bet I can beat you in a race to the cliff," Luffy suddenly said, smiling brightly as he looked off in a direction. Ace looked as well, his enhanced eyesight allowing him to see the cliff Luffy was talking about, confusing him. "How did you know there was a cliff there?" Ace asked, wondering if Luffy had more powers than he was letting them in on. Luffy's smile didn't fade. If anything it grew. "I can smell the ocean," Luffy explained, but that didn't really answer the question. "Luffy, it's an island, there's water all around us," Sabou said, also curious now. Luffy laughed, running off without giving an answer. "I'm gonna beat you too if you don't hurry," Luffy cheered, Ace and Sabou glancing each other for a second before smiling. "As if," Ace shouted, taking off after the youngest. "Like you could beat us Luffy," Sabou teased, also running after his brothers. The two eldest easily made their way past the youngest, but Luffy merely laughed loudly, charging after them. The three continued laughing loudly their entire way to the cliff, their previously bad mood gone completely, replaced with only happiness, joy, freedom. As they ran out from the tree line they slowed down, coming to a stop at the cliff's edge, looking out at the beauty of the water expanding across the horizon. Even though they were being chased down by Marines, even though so many bad things had happened to them in the past 7 years, even though they would be scarred for life, there was one thing that made it all better, one thing that made it seem like, even though all of those things had happened, it would still be okay. "Ace, Sabou?" Luffy asked softly, holding onto his hat as he looked up at the sky. His brothers turned to look at him, humming in question. Luffy's small smile grew into a wide, toothy grin. "I like being free. Well, it was fun while it lasted," Ace said mournfully as he and his brothers watched the island they had been on yesterday slowly drifting away from them. Sabou and Luffy nodded in agreement, already wanting to be back in the forest running through the trees and sparring with each other freely.
Hopefully the next island we go to will have another forest like that, Sabou said wistfully, his head resting on his arms as he leaned over the tall wall-like railing that lined the Mobi. And more meat. Luffy moaned, frowning. Ace and Sabou rolled their eyes at that, shaking their heads at Luffy's simple-mindedness. They watched on in silence as the island slowly became smaller and smaller in the distance until Sabou and Luffy couldn't see it anymore. It was just after breakfast now and the brothers were back to doing nothing. They still didn't have to do chores for another few weeks and they had no clue when they would be reaching the next island. Marco had told them that they were heading back to the New World now, but they didn't know how long it would take to get there. Sitting on the railing was quickly becoming a usual pastime for the three, having nothing better to do than that. Even though they were bored, they were okay with that, because it meant that they weren't back in the facility, fighting every day to survive. At least here, they could sit in relative peace, even if the mass of pirates around them still put them on edge. "Hey there," Thatch's voice made Sabou turn, noticing once again that Ace had fallen to another narcolepsy attack. Putting on a smile, Sabou looked at the man, trying his best to look as friendly as possible. "Hello Thatch." Sabou greeted back, Luffy turning around now as well so he could also watch the man. The chef walked a bit closer, stopping before he was too close for comfort, and began speaking. "I was wondering if you three would like to go." Thatch was cut off when the ship hit a particularly rough wave, everyone losing their balance briefly because of it. The jostle must have woken Ace up because the eldest grumbled and sat up, looking around in a daze, but Sabou couldn't even begin to explain to him what was happening because suddenly, Luffy was falling. 1 second the boy was at his side, holding onto the railing tightly, and the next he was falling backward, a small eep, leaving the boy's mouth as he did. "Luffy," Sabou called out, eyes wide as he turned to see the youngest splashing into the ocean. Ace flew up from where he had been laying, standing beside Sabou and peering over the railing to look for his brother. Sabou had to place a hand on the eldest's shoulder to keep him from jumping in after him. "Man overboard." They vaguely heard one of the pirates call the words out, more preoccupied with looking for their brother. "Do you see him?" Sabou asked Ace, looking frantically around in the waves. "He's trying to swim up," Ace replied, gripping the railing tightly as he watched through the water, watched Luffy begin struggling to the surface, all those tests in the water finally coming in somewhat handy. "He'll be fine, don't worry, Nemours already gone after him," Thatch tried to say soothingly, but even the chef looked a bit worried. "Can he swim, Yoi?" Marco asked, coming up as well, shocking the brothers a bit. The attention was all on them again with this new development, but they tried to ignore it. Before Ace could spit something out at the commander, Sabou answered, trying his best to sound calm, even if he looked anything but. "Not very well, we didn't have much time to practice," Sabou said through gritted teeth. "Luffy." Ace's shout cut off any more conversation between Sabou and Marco, the blonde brother spinning quickly to see Luffy's head poking up out of the water. A wave immediately crashing back over him though. Luffy was very obviously struggling and his brothers could see the terror in his eyes. At least he was above the water though. They could see Nemours now, closing in on Luffy until he finally reached him, pulling the small boy along with him now, back to the ship. Someone threw the rope ladder down for them and Ace and Sabou rushed over to it, watching anxiously as the fishman carried Luffy back up to them. They would have to hurry back to their room to keep anyone from seeing how weak the water made Luffy. Sure, they had already waved off any doubts of devil fruits, especially since they had all just seen Luffy very clearly treading water rather than sinking, but they didn't need anyone having doubts for any reason, or even send nurses at them. "Luffy," Ace and Sabou said in relief, retrieving their brother from the fishman's arms and hugging him close. "Thank you, Mr. Nemours, for retrieving our brother," Sabou said gratefully, Ace already ushering Luffy away to their room. "It was no problem, Sabou, really, and just Nemours is fine," Nemours said, Sabou nodding before running off after Ace and Luffy, leaving the pirates to watch after them. "Man, I thought I could finally talk to them," Thatch whined as he watched the brothers scurry off to their room, probably for the rest of the morning. Marco shook his head.
"I'm sure you'll find a time to talk, Thatch," Marco said, patting the chef on the back as he passed by him, on his way back to Pops.
"Yeah, besides, you've had tons of chances, you normally just blow him," Nemours said, shaking the water off of himself as he spoke. Thatch pouted.
"Like when you had a one-sided conversation with yourself instead of letting them talk." Someone piped up, Thatch's pout intensifying.
"Hey, I was just trying to keep them comfortable. They don't like talking all the time so I thought I'd do all the talking for them," Thatch defended, crossing his arms. Some laughed, Nemours shaking his head with a smile and walking away.
////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////////// could find on the youngest's body. Luffy nodded a bit sluggishly, frown on his face. Thoughts of the facility were rushing through his brain, remembering all the times they dunked him underwater, draining his strength, forcing him to hold his breath, forcing him to move his heavy limbs.
Ace frowned, noticing Luffy was shivering a bit. and moved closer, heating his body temperature up a bit to warm his brother. "You did good, Lu. On the bright side, none of those pirates'll be expecting you to have a devil fruit now," Ace said with a grin, ruffling Luffy's hair, gaining a small smile in response. "That's right, if anyone was suspicious they definitely aren't now, not after seeing you swim to the surface," Sabou said, setting the towel aside and picking up Luffy's wet clothes, placing them on the towel. Now that Luffy was dry and warming up, Sabou sighed, glancing at the door. "Why don't we relax here until lunch?" Sabou asked, turning to face Luffy. The boy nodded a bit sluggishly, leaning into Ace more and closing his eyes.
Taking that as a cue that he was tired, Ace maneuvered them so they were laying down comfortably, Sabou joining soon after.
"Pops." Marco greeted as he came to stand by Whitebeard's chair, turning to face his many brothers out on the deck, many mingling or doing chores. Seeing as they were still in paradise, there was little they had to worry about, giving them all a lot of downtime. "Son, what have you come to talk about?" Whitebeard asked, knowing that something was on his first mate's mind. Marco was quiet a moment, seeming to think about whatever it was he was going to say before he spoke. "I was thinking, Yoi, the brothers, they do a lot of tapping." Marco started, Whitebeard raising an eyebrow in confusion. "Oh, and why do you think that is?" Whitebeard asked, having a feeling Marco was having trouble distinguishing why that was himself.
"At first I thought it was a nervous tic, or a habit, Yoi," Marco said, Whitebeard nodding in understanding. "But now you think differently?" Whitebeard asked. Again, Marco went silent, thinking things over again.
"Before, when I saw them tapping, it looked like there was no pattern, like they didn't notice they were dollars, but then I started to realize that the tap seemed a bit deliberate, Yoi. Not only that, but when one stops tapping another starts, almost like they can't sit without tapping." Marco explained, his thoughts and theories running through his head. "Any ideas as to why that might be?" Whitebeard asked, encouraging his son to sort out his thoughts. "Not anything that I can come up with right now, Yoi. I just thought you'd like to know." Marco said with a hint of a sigh, as if he was annoyed with himself for not having figured out one of the many mysteries surrounding the brothers.
"Whatever it is, I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. Either way though, keep an eye on them. After the littlest brats dip in the water they seemed a bit more skittish. We want them to be comfortable here," Whitebeard said with a bit of a sigh, looking to the door that led to the brothers' room. Marco nodded, crossing his arms as he scanned the deck. "I think some will start getting frustrated soon with how closed off the brothers are. I'll try and calm them down though, Yoi," Marco said, knowing that there were more than a few of his brothers that were starting to get annoyed that the brothers weren't being as receptive to their attempts at friendly conversation as they would like. "Good. Try and get them to understand that those three have been through a lot. Sometimes your brothers can be a bit hard-headed," Whitebeard said with a fond smile, glancing to a few of his sons that he knew to be just that. Marco huffed a small laugh out, uncrossing his arms and standing straighter, smile on his face. "You've definitely got that right, Pops, Yoi," Marco said, walking off to get started on some more paperwork he had gotten earlier. He could hear Whitebeard laugh loudly behind him. "Come on you two, lunch is ready." Sabou groaned out a bit groggily. He hadn't meant to fall asleep, especially when Ace and Luffy were already sleeping, but at some point when listening to a few pirates drone on and on about barrels, they had to move from the upper deck to the lower. He had fallen asleep. Giving Luffy another shake, the youngest's eyes scrunched up a bit before he was blinking them open, grumbling. The same happened with Ace, and Sabou yawned, sitting back and trying to wake up. "Food?" Ace mumbled out, sitting up and wiping the crud from his eyes. Sabou nodded, getting out of the bed and standing. "From the sounds of it, yeah. Pretty sure we're actually a bit late," Sabou said, listening in and noticing he couldn't hear a single person out on deck, only those in the crow's nest. "Food," Luffy groaned out, getting out of bed in a zombie-like manner and stumbling a bit on his way to the door. Sabou chuckled quietly, catching his brother before he could face plant onto the floor after tripping over his own feet. "Calm down, Lu. I'm sure there'll still be some when we get there. Wake up a bit, you don't want to get overwhelmed suddenly when you walk in," Sabou said, knowing that, for all of them, their senses were more sensitive after just waking up, making it easier for them to be overwhelmed. "But I'm awake," Luffy whined, rubbing his eyes and pouting, trying to put on his best, awake, face. Sabou smiled, ruffling his hair. "Yeah, and Ace isn't narcoleptic," Sabou teased, Ace shouting a "hey" from where he was sitting on the bed and Luffy's pout deepening. "Anyways, Thatch is apparently a bit overwhelmed in the kitchen right now. Seems a few of the chefs are sick with the flu at the moment, so it's probably a good thing we're not there right now," Sabou said as he listened in, noticing how rushed the chef sounded, though, to the man's credit, he wasn't complaining. "Ah, but I'm hungry," Luffy whined again, waiting by the door as he complained. Sabou sighed at his brother's impatience. "Don't worry, Lu, we'll still eat," Sabou said as Ace stood up behind him, more awake now than he had been. Doing a quick once-over of Luffy showed that he was awake now as well, to which Sabou deemed it acceptable for them to leave their room. "Come on, we can head there now," Sabou said,
Luffy beaming happily and flinging the door open, waiting for his brothers before he went any further. The walk to the galley was made silently, and Luffy's enthusiasm quickly dimmed down as they got closer to the crowded room, remembering just how many people were in there. They finally reached the doors, Ace pushing them opening and scanning the room quickly as they walked in. Not many looked up to see them, most having gotten over the phase of staring at the brothers wherever they went. But there was still the few that glanced up to watch them, only to turn back to their friends after a second. "There you boys are, I was beginning to think you weren't gonna show up," Rikuyo said with a pleasant smile, waving to the brothers as they sat down. Sabou smiled back politely. "Sorry, we decided to take a nap and didn't get up until a few minutes ago." Sabou apologized easily, leaving his smile on his face. Rikuyo waved it off. "Ah, don't worry about it. Rest was probably a good thing after your brother's dip in the water. We don't want him catching a cold," Rikuyo said with concern, and Sabou wondered if it was genuine. A quick nudge to Luffy and he was quickly given confirmation that the man's words were indeed genuine, making Sabou wonder. "That we wouldn't," Sabou agreed, Rikuyo smiling as the conversation between them ended. "Even if you had been here on time it wouldn't have made a difference anyway," Atmos stated from where he sat, head in hand. Sabou raised an eyebrow at that, putting on a face of confusion. "Oh, why's that?" he asked, noticing that Luffy, who had been listening for a minute after Sabou had nudged him, was now more focused on something else. Probably trying to sense more feelings. "Seems some of the chefs caught the flu. Poor Thatch is working his butt off back there so lunch is a bit delayed," Lenham said, and Sabou had to act as if this was new information. "That's too bad, I hope they get better soon. Anyways, we don't mind waiting," Sabou said, knowing full well that Luffy did indeed mind waiting. With that conversation over as well, Sabou focused more on the conversations already being had by the other commanders at the table. Marco and Izo were absent, but other than that everyone else was there, even Whitebeard. "I'm adding in another 100 on my bet that it'll take a month," Jiru said, sliding some money over to Haruta who happily pocketed the money. "No way, did you see how mad Marco was? He's totally about to burst. 2 on mine that it'll happen by the end of Friday this week," Vista said confidently, also sliding money Haruta's way. "You guys are idiots. If Marco ever finds out about this you're all going down," Namor said, shaking his head, arms crossed. "Yeah, but Marco won't find out if no one says anything," Haruta said happily, smiling cheerfully to the fish man who merely rolled his eyes. Whitebeard laughed from his end of the table, watching the commanders the entire time. "Still, I can't believe you've delayed Thatch from putting those poles away for this long. In just another, little over a week, it'll have been an entire month," Curiel said with slight amazement to his tone. This had Haruta puffing his chest out proudly, but whatever he said next was ignored by Sabou whose attention was quickly drawn to Luffy. Ace looked as well, also having caught the slight shiver that had run through Luffy just a second ago. "What's wrong, Lou?" Ace quickly tapped out, glancing around quickly to make sure no one was watching them. Luffy frowned deeply, eyebrows scrunching up in confusion. "Luffy," Sabou tried when the boy didn't respond. Luffy glanced to Ace, and then to Sabou before looking down at the table. "I thought I felt the darkness." Luffy tapped a bit slowly. That was enough for Ace and Sabou to go rigid, both of them ready to jump ship that second. Even though Sabou had always tried to drill into Ace that they couldn't just go off on their own without supplies, he was ready to do exactly that. If someone on this ship had Theo longer safe, especially not when they knew Marines were looking for them and would probably send them right back to another facility if they had the chance. Before either Ace or Sabou could grab Luffy and run though, Luffy elaborated. "I thought I felt it, but after a minute it was gone, and it was really faint," Luffy said, though he looked a bit confused. Ace and Sabou were also confused now too. As far as they knew you couldn't just hide a feeling, especially if that feeling was darkness, so how had the feeling disappeared? They were on a ship in the middle of the ocean. If someone with the darkness had been here they wouldn't have gone out of Luffy's range that quickly. "What do you mean it was faint?" Ace asked, thinking that, maybe, if the feeling was barely a feeling at all, it had gone away naturally. Luffy's frown deepened further if possible and he looked even more confused. "I don't know, it was like the person had lots of darkness, but it was muffled. Like they weren't here, but they were 'cause I was feeling the darkness." Luffy tapped out. The rigidness left Ace and Sabou slowly with the news that the threat, most likely, wasn't on board still, and even if they were, the feeling was gone. That didn't mean that they weren't going to be on extra guard now though. "Well, for now, let's just be extra cautious, and Luffy, double-check the commanders again, make sure that it wasn't coming from any of them." Sabou tapped. Luffy nodded and the brothers returned to their normal formation to keep guard, Sabou trying his best to tune back into the commander's conversations while trying to ignore the new thoughts buzzing inside his head. It was at this point that Thatch was coming out with plates on a platter, looking a little more than tired. "Alright everyone, lunch is ready. Get in line," Thatch called out, the pirates cheering at the announcement, tables standing and heading over to where the brothers assumed the food was. Thatch walked over to them, the commanders getting up and leaving as well. And for you three, here's your meals. Thatch said with a tired smile, placing their food in front of them, also moving to hand Whitebeard his own as well. Thank you, Thatch, but you didn't have to bring us our food, we could have gone and gotten it ourselves if it made it easier, Sabou said, not wanting to be a burden. He didn't want the tipping point for the pirates to be the fact that they ate so much. No, it's fine, really, it's just that 2 chefs aren't enough to make all these people food in a timely manner without any of us feeling the effects. Thatch said with a sigh, sitting down heavily on the bench and pulling out a cigarette. If you need some help, I'm sure some of your brothers wouldn't mind helping, Whitebeard said with a soft smile, glancing around the lively galley. Thatch sighed. Last time we got help from someone outside my division, Hayden nearly lost a finger and we were set back even further when Pete started a fire, Thatch said with a shake of his head. It's a shame most of your division is gone on a mission, Whitebeard said sympathetically. Oh well, hopefully, the others will feel better tomorrow and can help out again. For now, I've gotta head back and get started on dinner, maybe it'll be done on time, Thatch said, begrudgingly standing up. It was good seeing you three, Thatch ended with a wave, yawning as he headed to the kitchen. By this point, many of the commanders were returning with plates of food, the other pirates settling down as well. So Pops, where are Marco and Izo at? Fosa asked as he sat down. Sabou glanced at his brothers to check the progress they had made on their food so far before turning back to the conversation. They're checking in on your brothers who are on missions, Whitebeard answered, taking a bite of his own food. Ah, shouldn't a few of them be back soon? The commander asked, thinking back to something. Whitebeard nodded. A few, yes. We'll be meeting with some once we get back to the New World as well, Whitebeard explained, Fosa nodding in understanding. The doors opened, Sabou only noticing because Ace's eyes flicked over to them, and he saw Marco and Izo walk in, both of them talking to each other. Tuning out of the commander's conversation, Sabou quickly tuned in to the pair talking, curious as to what they could be speaking about. Thatch's division said they would be heading back here next week. They just reached the island they were said to check up on, Izo said as he picked at his nails for a second. Marco nodded.
Good, Pops was hoping they would make it there within this week. Ryan's group should be here by tomorrow at the latest. Teach's should be back within a few days as well, Yoy. Marco replied, the two of them finally reaching the table and sitting down.
Hey Marco, Izo, welcome to lunch, Haruta greeted cheerily, and Sabou assumed the topic of Thatch's fishing poles had once again been brought up by how suspiciously normal Haruta was trying to act. Sabou didn't ponder on that though as he noticed Ace and Luffy were finishing up their lunches. With that observation, Sabou quickly finished his own, the three of them standing in sync and making their way out of the room quickly before anyone could stop or notice them. No one was out on deck yet, only the brothers, so they didn't bother to head straight to the railing like they usually would. Luffy, do you know where you might have felt the darkness? Ace asked. Sabou gave Ace a confused look, not quite sure what he was planning. Noticing the look, Ace frowned. What? If someone had the darkness, we should go check it out. Besides, no one's out here right now besides those guys in the crow's nest, but they're not even looking at us. Now's the perfect time to go snooping. Ace tapped out as if it were the obvious next step. Sabou sighed but didn't have time to explain to Ace what a bad idea that was before Luffy was answering. I don't know, it was really hard to feel, but I think it came from over there, Luffy said, pointing to the door that led to one of the many hallways inside the Moby. Great, let's go, Ace said, already stalking his way to the door. Although Sabou also wanted to know where the feeling had come from, he couldn't help but feel that, if they were caught snooping, this would only do more harm than good for the brothers. Regardless, he followed his brother, who was suddenly filled with a determination Sabou had only seen when they were escaping the facility. Luffy was beside Ace, holding onto the eldest's hand as he guided them to where he had felt the darkness. I don't know where it was after this, Luffy said, stopping them at the end of the hallway they had been walking down. There were 3 doors that they could go through, one in front of them and one on their left and right. So whoever had the bad feeling was in one of these rooms then, Ace said, glancing at the doors. Ace, not that I want to throw a wrench in this plan of yours, but the pirates are finishing lunch and I don't think they'll especially like that we're here, Sabou said, hearing the footsteps of pirates leaving the galley, making their way on deck. Well, are any coming this way? Ace asked, arms folded over his chest. Another quick listen told Sabou that, no, so far no one was heading their way. No, but then I'm checking out these rooms. If someone starts coming, we'll leave. Ace tapped dismissively, grabbing the handle of the door in front of them and pushing his way in. Ace, Sabou hissed angrily but followed nonetheless. His brother may be an idiot, but he wasn't going to leave him behind for that idiocy. Luffy was seeming to understand just what trouble they could get into for doing this, the youngest shifting around nervously as he glanced around the room. What about your rules? Remember one of the big ones, don't do anything to make them turn on us. I would say this violates that rule big time, Sabou hissed as quietly as he could manage with how angry and nervous he was. He had his hearing focused on every single step he could manage, preying on art heading their way. The darkness trumps all those rules, Ace muttered as he shuffled through papers on the desk in the room. Wherever they were, it seemed to be almost like an office, or filing room. There was a desk that was littered with papers and bookcases all around, files and books all over. A glance told Sabou that this was probably where the Whitebeards kept all their important information, and that only made this all the more dangerous. I don't think you understand, Ace, darkness or not, if they find us in here they're kicking us off for sure. These pirates have hockey, Ace. They don't need to see where we are to know we're in here, Sabou said, practically seething as he couldn't get through to the hothead. Ace was frowning, but Sabou had a feeling it wasn't because of him, rather he probably couldn't find anything. Ace, what are you even looking for? Sabou asked, ready to drag his brother out. Calm down, Sabou. I'm just looking for anything that might show they were calling the Marines, Ace hissed, his own annoyance raising. Luffy, who was in this room last? Ace asked, getting the smallest's attention. Luffy, who had been fidgeting quietly, sniffed the air for a second. Lot of the commandeers, Luffy said hesitantly. Ace scowled as he moved to the bookcases, skimming over folders and books quickly. It's Commanders Luffy and you, Ace. Let's just go. There's nothing here, Sabou said, almost mindlessly correcting Luffy's mistaken words. You're right. Let's try the next room, Ace said, leaving the room they were in and heading to the one that had been on their left. No, that's not what I meant, Ace, Sabou said, barely containing the shout he so desperately wanted to release. Once again, Ace ignored him, making his way into the new room, Sabou making sure to close the previous door shut before following. Man, nothing in here but stupid snails, Ace muttered as he glanced around the room. It only had a big table with chairs all around it and multiple transponder snails in the middle of the table. Great, can we go now? Sabou asked, grabbing Ace's sleeve before the team could head to the next room. No, there's still one more, SSH. Someone's heading this way, Sabou said, eyes going wide as he slapped a hand on Ace's mouth. Ace glared at him but fell silent, the brothers quietly leaving the room and shutting the door. What do we do? Luffy asked, and already Sabou could see the terror in his eyes. Don't worry, just follow me. Sabou tapped back as he waited for the footsteps to get a bit closer. He had been too caught up in trying to leave that he had missed Vista's steps heading their way. Once he deemed the commander close enough, Sabou walked down the hallway to the intersection the Vista was coming up to. I told you we should have finished that tour with Izo, now we're lost, Sabou said, doing his best to use how annoyed and angry he was with Ace to his advantage. Catching on quickly, Ace scowled at him. It's not my fault. How was I supposed to know how big this ship was? Ace asked grumpily, arms once again crossed over his chest. Luffy stood silently between his brothers, knowing that they had things under control now, the tension quickly leaving him. There you boys are. Vista's words had the brothers turning to look at the approaching man, Sabou quickly slipping a smile onto his face. Ah, Vista, it's a good thing you found us, we got a bit lost, Sabou said, laughing sheepishly and rubbing the back of his head, hoping the act was believable. Vista smiled and laughed, making Sabou believe it had worked well enough. We thought you had taken another swim. It's a good thing Marco sensed you before anyone could go into too much of a panic, Vista said with another laugh, Sabou laughing along as well. We're sorry to have worried you, but would you mind showing us the way back to the deck? Ace thought he knew the way to a closer bathroom and ended up getting us lost on the way back. Sabou explained, sending Ace a smile while the eldest glared back. No problem, just follow me. I'm not surprised you got lost, these halls can be a bit confusing, the mustached commander said, turning and heading back towards where the deck was. Thank you.